So I'm an organizational psychologist. That means I'm usually the guy who gets called after 3 or 4 consultants have been fired. And at that point, I can do no harm. And when I walk into workplaces of all different industries, I find that most people are paranoid. And I thought it would be fun to figure out how common paranoia is here. So what I'd like you to do is just look around the room, identify the most paranoid person, and then please point at that person. OK, don't actually do it. I want to talk today about what causes paranoia in our work and our lives. But I really want to ask, what does it take to own a face that looks like that? Now, those of you who are paranoid, there is a group of people lurking in your lives who are probably responsible for the majority of it. They're called takers. Takers are the people who try to get as much as possible from others and avoid giving back, unless they have to. They're great at social loafing and shirking. They volunteer for interesting, visible, important projects, and then leave the grunt work for everyone else. But somehow they walk away with the lion's share of credit for collective achievements, which is why I know everyone in this room loves working with takers. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people that I've come to call givers. For me, a giver is not a philanthropist, not a volunteer, but just someone who enjoys helping others, and often does it with no strings attached. Sharing knowledge, providing mentoring, showing up early or staying late to support the people around you. Now, many of us love the idea of being givers. It resonates with our core values. But we also know there are takers out there. So what we decide to do most of the time is we say, I'll be a giver with my family, with my friends, maybe a few trusted colleagues. And then in the rest of my relationships, we choose a third style, which is called matching. Those of you who are matchers, you try to keep an even balance of give and take, quid pro quo. I'll do something for you if you do something for me. That seems like a pretty safe way to live your life. What I want to ask today, though, is that the most effective and productive way to live your life? And the answer is going to be a very definitive maybe. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to think about the givers, takers, and matchers that you've known or worked with. Who's the most successful? Who's the least successful? But first, I want to give you a chance to assess your own style. We all have moments of giving, taking, and matching. Your style is just how you treat most of the people most of the time. So I've prepared a short test that you can take to figure out where you fall on this spectrum. You can start whenever you're ready. Now, this is the only statement I will make this afternoon that has no data behind it. But I am convinced the longer it took you to laugh at this cartoon, the more we should be worried about your taker score. Now, I like this cartoon because it reminds us that takers are one kind of narcissist and vice versa. Right? A lot of takers believe that if I want to win, somebody else has to lose. But there's another kind of taker that's more common than a narcissist. It's somebody who used to be a giver or a matcher and then got burned one too many times. And learn the hard way. It's dangerous to be generous. And sometimes it's even risky to trade favors like a matcher, because the smart takers will promise you a fair deal and then stab you in the back. So for a lot of takers, they don't mean to be cruel or cutthroat. They just say, look, the world's a dog-eat-dog competitive place, and if I don't put myself first, nobody else will. Now, there is a third kind of taker I won't be addressing today. That's called a psychopath. But the other two kinds of takers, the narcissists, the recovering givers and matchers, who used to be a little bit more generous and then got frightened away, you can change their styles. We can shift the way they interact with others. I want to talk about that a bit later. But first, let's talk about the success of the givers, takers, and matchers. The data were very clear across 3 different kinds of jobs. We had engineers, where we track productivity as a function of the number of favors you do for your colleagues versus the number of favors you receive in return. We have medical students. And there we're going to measure your grades throughout medical school based on how much you like to help others. And then we also track salespeople. And in sales, we want to know what happens to your sales revenue as a function of how hard you work to serve your clients and your customers. Now, despite the fact that these jobs have very different success metrics, there is one group that consistently performs the worst. And I wanted to just get a sense of the opinion in the room. Can we just get a vote? How many people think on average the takers are the worst performers? Raise your hands high, please, so we can spot the optimists in the room. OK, good. How many people think the matchers are the worst performers? And how many for the givers? OK, I have some sad news. It is the givers who are the worst performers consistently. The engineers who get the least done and make the most mistakes are the ones who do more favors than they get back. They're so busy doing other people's jobs, they literally run out of time and energy to get their own work done. In medicine, the lowest grades through medical school belong to the students who agree most strongly with statements like, "I love helping others," which suggests the doctor you ought to trust is the one who came to medical school with no desire to help anybody. And then in sales, the lowest revenue accrues to the most generous salespeople who go above and beyond for their colleagues and their clients. I used to work in sales, and I found this a little bit puzzling. So I went through all our data sets, and I found the guy with the highest giver score in his company, the lowest revenue. And I asked him, "How do you explain this? Why do you suck at your job?" I didn't ask it that way. But what is the cost of generosity in sales? And he said, "Well, just to be completely honest, I care so deeply about my customers that I would never sell them one of our crappy products." Now, I think this is a tragedy for givers. How many of you self-identify more as givers than takers or matchers? Okay, it would have been more before we talked about these data. And how many of you believe you're givers but didn't raise your hand because you know that would violate the norm of modesty? Which givers are supposed to live by, right? Now, look, I know there are a lot of givers in this room. I think one of the real treats of being here at the Nantucket Project is this is a whole group of people who believe in trying to make the world a little bit better than they found it. But the sad thing is, when givers try to do that, they sacrifice their own success. One of the worst examples of this that I've ever seen is Kat Cole. For those of you who may know Kat, she grew up in Florida, raised by a single mother who had to work 3 jobs to support her family. Day Kat turns 15. When she's old enough, she ends up taking jobs of her own. She's working in a mall selling clothes and also at a restaurant serving food. She does that all through high school. And she ends up becoming the first person in her family to make it to college. But Kat is the kind of classic giver who fails to secure her oxygen mask before helping others. And as a result, she suffers. One day in a restaurant, a manager doesn't show up, and Kat is the first person to take it upon herself to organize the schedules. So everyone has their desired shift, restaurant can maintain smooth operations. Another day, a cook quits, and Kat races back into the kitchen to start cooking, even though that's not her role, because she wants to make sure that everyone gets served. She doesn't really get any credit or recognition for it. This is the kind of behavior that drives Sheryl Sandberg insane. But if the story stopped there, it would be a little bit sad. But then it takes a surprising twist and gets even worse. Kat ends up working so hard to help other people at her restaurant that she fails all of her classes and has to drop out of college. And this is what happens to a lot of givers. They are too selfless. They either burn themselves out or they just plain get burned by the takers around them. That led me to wonder, if the givers are the worst performers, who are the best performers? Track the productivity of engineers again, the grades of medical students, and the revenue of salespeople. Who do you think comes out on top? How many for the takers on average? Okay, matchers? And how many of you didn't raise your hands? Okay, thanks for participating this afternoon. Maybe you didn't raise your hand because you already anticipated what took me a decade to figure out. Let me start with the good news. The takers are not the best performers in most jobs. They tend to rise quickly, but they also fall quickly. And they fall at the hands of matchers. If you are a matcher, you believe in an eye for an eye, a just world. What goes around comes around. And when it doesn't, you know it's time to step up and become what you might think of as the karma police. There is nothing a matcher hates more than seeing a taker act selfishly and get away with it. It's not fair. Right? So true matchers, when you meet a taker, you feel like it's your mission in life to just punish the hell out of that person. And that way justice is served. Some matchers will be bold about this. They will actually feed takers false information and try to sabotage their success. Most matchers, though, choose an equally deadly yet more subtle ancient weapon called gossip. It usually goes something like this. Don't trust this guy. He's a selfish bastard. And that makes it really hard for takers to sustain their success because most people are matchers by default. And that means you can't just burn a bridge with one person and start over fresh in a new relationship. There's usually a matcher waiting in the wings to spread negative reputational information and protect everybody else from the wrath of a taker. I've learned recently, though, that matchers are not the only people plotting the demise of takers. Who else hates to see takers thrive? Yeah, exactly, other takers. There is actual evidence that the people who blow the whistle the loudest on the cheaters are themselves the biggest cheaters. If you play professional baseball or if you're a performance cyclist, you are determined, if you're a taker, to be the only one doping. Right? Because if you're a taker, you want to clear all the other takers out of the system, and then you can free ride on the backs of the givers and the matchers. This is not to say that takers can't succeed, only that they face an increasingly uphill battle. Right? You've got ordinary matchers undermining you, and then you have the most ruthless of the takers trying to make sure that you don't succeed. So the logical conclusion then is that it must be the matchers who are the best performers. But they're not. The data show in every job and every organization I've ever studied that the best results belong to the givers again. How could this be? Givers are overrepresented on both extremes. If you look at the bottom 25% of performers in most jobs, you will find more generous people in that group than there should be statistically. But if you look at the top 25% of performers, you will find givers overrepresented there too. And I think this is a fascinating paradox, that helping others could sink your career, but it could also accelerate it. That good guys and gals have a better chance of finishing last than the rest of us, but also higher odds of finishing first. How do we explain that? There are a lot of different factors that matter, but one is time. Let's return to the story of Kat Cole. When we left her, she was failing out of college, cooking and organizing schedules in a restaurant instead of actually studying. At age 19, though, a manager calls her and says, "We're thinking about opening a restaurant overseas, and we're wondering if you want to apply for the job." Kat says, "I'm not qualified." She has less experience, less education than every other candidate, but she gets the job because she is the only person who has done every single position in that restaurant. And she ends up getting sent to Latin America, Southeast Asia, Australia, opens up restaurants all around the world, comes back to the US and heads up corporate training at age 26. A few years later, at 32, she's named the president of a brand that some of you have heard of. It's called Cinnabon. Under her leadership 4 years later, it's worth over $1 billion. And I know some of you may be wondering, would a giver really sell gooey treats? Kat's response is, we're all going to eat this stuff. It might as well taste really good. But if you ask Kat how she accounts for her meteoric rise, she will tell you it was all about helping others. That yes, in the short run, it was inefficient for her to be cooking and organizing schedules. But in the long run, the time she spent solving other people's problems made her better at solving the organization's problems. And that is one of the advantages that givers accrue over time. It's a knowledge and skill edge. You actually learn things through helping other people solve their problems. There's also, of course, a social capital upside. Right? The relationship and reputational gains of being the kind of person who helps others without expecting anything in return are huge, but they don't happen right away. What I want to do is figure out how we can accelerate the success of givers. Build organizations, teams, and communities where people not only are motivated to help others, but then when they do that, it does not cause them to suffer. So I want to give you a top 10 list of the most important steps that you can take to create a world with more givers. But sadly, I can only think of 3. So we'll make it a top 3 list. Let's start with what parents and teachers can do. How do we shape children in the giving direction? I think the first thing that you do is you look at the moments of generosity that children naturally exhibit. We can track empathy in kids as early as ages 1 to 2. There are lots of moments where you will catch even toddlers sharing and caring and helping. And the question is, when you observe that behavior, how do you reinforce it? What most parents do is they reinforce the behavior. They say, that was a really nice thing to do. Thank you for sharing. And those are the wrong things to say because the evidence is overwhelming that it works better in the moral domain to praise character than to praise behavior. Don't say thank you for sharing. Say thank you for being a sharer. Don't say it was really nice that you helped. Say it was really nice that you were a helper. And you can more than double the likelihood that kids then are going to repeat that behavior. Why? Because when you praise their character in this moral domain, they actually start to internalize it as part of their identity and say, this is the kind of person I am, as opposed to this was an isolated act. Now, of course, you can't just tell them they're good people all the time. You also need to criticize them when they fail. And disappointment is the emotion that seems to work best there. When children fall short of engaging in generous behaviors, I found that you let me down is a great response empirically. Because it said, I had high expectations of you, but also you fell short of them. And I believe you can do better next time. The beauty of disappointment is that it cultivates guilt. And we all know guilt is the gift that keeps on giving. So that's the first thing to think about. Praise character. and then think about criticizing behavior. You can also, though, use the character idea in the negative domain. If you want people not to lie, steal, and cheat, don't tell them not to lie, steal, and cheat. Instead of say, don't be a liar, don't be a cheater, don't be a thief. And cheating, lying, and stealing get cut in half. Secondly, if you want to build a world with more givers, you want to think carefully about who you surround yourself with. If you want a culture of givers, if you want a team of givers, what kinds of people should you let into your organization or your life? Not a rhetorical question, I'm actually asking. What kinds of people? Givers, that's what I thought too. Sadly, the data tell a different story. It is really nice to have the right people on your bus, but it is critical to keep the wrong people off that bus. The negative impact of a taker on a team is typically double to triple the positive impact of a giver. Think about it this way. One bad apple can spoil a barrel, but one good egg does not make a dozen. I don't know what that means. I hope you do. Now look, put even one taker in a room, and all of a sudden paranoia will start to spread. People will be watching their backs, worrying that somebody's out to get them. And if that person's a taker, it's not a delusion, right? They really are out to get you. Whereas if you put one giver in a team, you don't get a mass explosion of generosity. Instead, people are like, great, you can do all my work. So you actually don't want to focus on bringing givers into your life. What you want to do is weed takers out of your life. How do you do that? The best method I have seen ever was invented recently by IKEA. The takers may take that a little too literally. Couple ways to catch a taker. One is, watch out for kissing up and kicking down. Takers are great fakers when dealing with powerful people, but then they learn it's a lot of work to pretend to care about everybody. Peers and subordinates get much more accurate information about the true colors of somebody's character than do bosses. Secondly, watch out for really attractive social media profile pictures. If you go to the LinkedIn or Facebook page of takers, they are actually rated as more attractive than the rest of us. They're not hotter on average than the rest of us. There's just a bigger gap between how they usually look and how good that profile picture looks. Especially the narcissistic takers want to put their best foot forward. Third thing to do is watch out for agreeable people. You all know agreeableness. It's a personality trait that exists in every culture around the world. Agreeable people are warm, friendly, polite, welcoming, nice people. Disagreeable people, more critical, skeptical, challenging. Most of us assume that agreeable people are givers and disagreeable people are takers. But there is no correspondence between those categories. Because agreeableness is your outer veneer. Is it pleasant to interact with you? Whereas giving and taking are your inner motives. What are your intentions toward others? So if you really want to judge people accurately, you've got to draw the 2x2, giver, taker, agreeable, disagreeable. Agreeable givers, easy to spot. They say yes to everything. Disagreeable takers are also easy to recognize, although we may call them by a slightly different name. The other two combinations are the ones to be more mindful of. There are disagreeable givers in our lives. People who on the surface might be gruff and tough, but underneath have others' best interests at heart. And they are the most undervalued people in our lives, because they're willing to give the critical feedback that nobody wants to hear, but everyone needs to hear. They play devil's advocate. They challenge the status quo. They ask tough questions. And we need to do a much better job appreciating these people as opposed to saying, little prickly, must be a selfish jerk. Now, for those of you who are having trouble recognizing what is a disagreeable giver, I've spotted at least 4 in this room today. But I think the best description was from a Google engineer who said, a disagreeable giver is just somebody with a really bad user interface, but a great operating system. Now, the last combination is the deadly one. The agreeable takers are the best fakers, right? Those are the people who are friendly to your face, and then they throw you under the bus. And I should just say as a quick aside, there is one country on Earth that has more trouble with this than any other, because it's the most agreeable country on the planet. Anybody know what that is? Who said Canada? It is Canada. Now, before I go further, is anyone Canadian? It's all right, you're agreeable. You won't be offended, right? There was a Toronto radio station years ago that said, we need more national slogans, we need more Canadian pride. So they took as American as apple pie, and they said, let's come up with a Canadian equivalent. as Canadian as, and I'm thinking the winning entry is going to be maple syrup or ice hockey. But no, 4 million Canadians voted for the best demonstration of agreeableness you will ever find. I kid you not, the winning entry was as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. For those of you who are highly Canadian or slightly agreeable, you get this right away. How could I ever say I'm any one thing when I'm constantly trying to adapt and please other people? And if that's you, it's well to remember that just because someone is nice to you does not mean they actually care about you. Last way to spot a taker is to ask them questions about other people's behavior. So if I were to ask you, what % of people in the US do you think steal at least $10 US from their companies in a typical month? What would you say? Defining theft broadly, cash, intellectual property, merchandise, materials. What percentage? Shout some out. All right, that's a range. I heard between 4 and 90. I don't actually know what the answer is, nor do I care. But I care what you think the answer is, because the higher your estimate that other people are thieves, the greater the chances that you, sir, are a thief. If you're sitting near someone with a 70% or higher estimate, I would check your wallet immediately. But what happens is when we forecast the behavior of others, we tend to project our own motives onto them. Right? So an extreme taker answering this question is like, let's see, what % of people steal at least $10? Takers always talk that way. Last week I stole $384. I'm assuming 10 a month has got to be pretty common, 92%. An extreme giver answering the same question. How do you even steal $10 from a company? How many pens do you have to take home to add up to 10? It's about 70, by the way. But what kind of person would do such a thing? 7%. Notice how the giver sounds exactly like me, by the way. But these differences play out in large groups. People, as takers, they justify their behavior by saying, it's not me, it's all of you people that are selfish. And I'm just being smart and self-protective. So if you meet somebody who thinks that everybody else is a taker, they may want to take a look in the mirror. Now, there are other ways you can catch takers, of course. You can pay a lot of attention to the words they use. But the last thing that I want to highlight is, I think, the most powerful one, which is if you want to create a world with more givers, you need to get everyone around you to be better at asking for help, to get a whole culture or a whole community of help seekers. Why? The data show that 75 to 90% of all helping starts with a request. There are not that many proactive givers in our lives. Most people will help when asked, but they don't volunteer. So if we want people to give, we have to make our own needs more transparent, and there's a really easy way to do that. It's called the reciprocity ring. All you do is you gather a group of people, could be 10, could be 100, and you ask them all to make a request for something they want or need, but cannot get on their own. And then you challenge everybody else in the room to try to fulfill the request. This is an extremely powerful exercise. I'll give you one quick example. I've been running this in my classes at Wharton since I started teaching there, because I want to get students in the habit of giving help, but also asking for it. And one year, a student named Alex raised his hand and said, I haven't told a lot of people this, but my dream is to work at Six Flags amusement park. I just think riding a roller coaster is nirvana, and I want to be part of that. But strangely, Six Flags does not recruit at the Wharton school. So does anybody know a way to get my foot in the door? And I'm looking around thinking, what are the odds that anybody has a connection? But there's another student, Andrew, who says, I think I have a contact. And Andrew does a really quick 5-minute favor. He reaches out, and 2 weeks later, Alex comes into class, and I ask for an update. And Alex says, you will not believe this. I just spent an hour on the phone with the ex-CEO of Six Flags. And I'm thinking, this is the greatest thing that's happened ever in my life, certainly in my classroom. Did he give you a job? Did he open up other connections in the industry? And Alex breaks out in this huge grin, and he's like, you will not believe the outcome of this. The guy was so generous, I learned a ton, and I never want to work there. I was sad for a while. Then I realized he can rule out that dream and pursue others. And I was thrilled that he actually ended up becoming a management consultant who one day will fix the amusement park industry. This is a great exercise because, one, it makes the givers ask. Givers are normally uncomfortable being on the receiving end, burdening others. But when they go through an exercise like this where everyone makes a request, they step up. A lot of them still cheat, They will ask on behalf of other people, which is not really the point. But if you need a gateway drug to get to the hard stuff, so be it. Secondly, the takers give. By making everyone's contributions transparent, the takers do not want to get caught. So if you do this in a small group, you literally volunteer help out loud, and the takers know if they don't do that, everybody's going to know they're a taker. So they step up. Do it in a large group. People write their requests on flip charts. You go around and sign up where you think you can help. Again, the takers know if I don't sign up, everybody's going to know who I am. So we find on average the takers more than triple their contributions to others over the course of this exercise relative to what they would do when they're not visible. Third benefit is the matchers actually learn that matching is not the most efficient way to live their lives. There is a time and a place for matching for sure. But matchers realize if I'm always trading favors back and forth, when I really need help, I can only go to the people that I've helped in the past or expect to in the future. Whereas if I've invested in a whole network of givers, when I really need help, I can go to anybody in that network, which maximizes my chances of getting the best connected person or the most knowledgeable expert. And matchers realize if I actually can act more like a giver, then we can all get more of what we want. Now, if you do that well, what you will find is that paranoia may actually reverse, that people will redefine success. Instead of saying, like a taker would, I'm going to play a game of Battleship and try to sink every other boat in the sea, givers actually try to become the rising tide that lifts all boats. And instead of being paranoid that others are out to get them, they actually experience its opposite. It's called pronoia. Pronoia, for those of you who have never felt it, is the delusional belief that other people are plotting your well-being. Going around behind your back and saying exceptionally nice things about you. How dare they? Well, I think if people are going to live in fear in organizations, instead of worrying that others are out to get them, it would be kind of neat if they were terrified that others were out to help them. And that's the promise of a world with more givers. Now, for me, this has been a strange journey because I've gotten introduced before as the guy who studies altruism in the temple of greed. And for a long time, I didn't talk about this research at all. I went around about my daily life basically teaching one thing and studying another. When I decided to go public with this message, I was stunned by the number of people who said, I actually really believe in giving and helping others. I'm just afraid that nobody else does. And I think one of the best things we can do to overcome that is to get people to be a little bit more comfortable with nonconformity. There is an amazing book coming out in February, which I wrote. Now, I think the biggest question for me that's come out of this work is how do we change takers into givers? How do we shift a cultural conversation that's about what's in it for me and get people to ask, what can I contribute to others? And I think that's the question that we all need to focus more on. It's the one I'm going to be spending the next 4 or 5 years on. And it's been an honor to share ideas with you guys. Thank you very much for having me.